in the sterile corridors of Washington's most powerful legal firm. She was a ghost in a blue uniform, a woman who moved like a shadow across marble floors. They spoke of billion-dollar betrayals while she emptied their waste-bins, never realizing that every discarded memo and every whispered secret was being woven into a noose. She wasn't just cleaning their offices. She was methodically erasing their futures, one floor at a time. For 10 long years, Alina Thorne lived for the silence of the night, waiting for the exact moment when the architects of her husband's ruin would finally leave their ivory towers unguarded. The building at 1400 Pennsylvania Avenue did not just house offices, it breathed power. It was a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to inhale the humid, heavy air of the district, and exhale a chilled, filtered arrogance. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the structure belonged to the silence, and to her footsteps, encased in thick-soled rubber shoes, made no sound against the white Calicotta marble of the lobby, a stone so polished it looked like a frozen lake under the moonlight. The air here always carried a peculiar scent, a mixture of expensive floor wax, the ozone of high-powered servers, and the faint, lingering perfume of women who bought jewelry that cost more than Elena's annual salary. It was the scent of success, but to Elena it smelled like a crime scene that had never been processed. Alina Thorne was 62, though her eyes held a clarity that belonged to someone who had seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking. Her hands were mapped with the geography of labor veins, like blue rivers under skin that had been scrubbed raw by industrial detergents for a decade. She didn't look like a revolutionary. She looked like a woman who had been defeated by life, a relic of a bygone era, who was grateful for the night shift because it meant she didn't have to explain her grief to the living. But beneath the faded fabric of her navy blue coveralls, tucked against the small of her back, was a digital scanner, no larger than a pack of gum. It was her weapon, her silent witness. Every night, the ritual was the same. She would start on the 12th floor, the domain of the junior associates where the trash was filled with discarded coffee, cups, and the frantic energy of ambition. Then she would descend. By the time she reached the top floor, the inner sanctum of the partners, the atmosphere shifted. Here, the air was thinner, colder. The carpets were thicker, swallowing the sound of her industrial vacuum cleaner, a machine that hummed with a low, mournful drone that masked the clicking of her scanner. She moved through the office of Marcus Sterling, the man whose signature had once signed away her husband's life with the grace of a predator. She remembered the day the world collapsed. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing slide into poverty. David, her husband, had been a mid-level accountant at this very firm. He had found a discrepancy, a black hole, where $40 million had simply vanished into offshore accounts. He had been a man of integrity, a man who believed that the law was a shield for the weak, not a sword for the powerful. They didn't kill him with a bullet. They killed him with litigation, with slander, and finally, with the crushing weight of a prison sentence for a crime he didn't commit. He died in a sterile infirmary, clutching Elena's hand, his voice a rasping whisper that promised her the truth would eventually outlast the lie. Alina had spent the first year after his death in a fog of despair, watching as Sterling and his cohorts rose to the heights of political influence, their names etched in gold on the very doors she now cleaned. Alina knelt by Sterling's mahogany desk. The wood was cold under her fingertips, polished to a mirror finish. She didn't look for gold or jewels. She looked for the discarded. In the bottom of a heavy silver shredding bin, she saw it, a single, unshredded corner of a memorandum. It was a pale blue paper, the kind used only for internal, high-security communications. It was a fragment of a name that had been erased from the public record 10 years ago. Her heart did not race. It slowed. A singular, cold pulse of adrenaline moved through her limbs. She carefully retrieved the fragment, placing it into a silk-lined pouch hidden within her cleaning cart. The game had not just begun, It was entering its final lethal phase. The blue paper was textured, a heavy linen bond that felt almost organic, like skin. It bore the watermark of a bank that no longer officially existed, phantom institution based in the Cayman Islands. As Alina held it between her thumb and forefinger, the silence of the room seemed to deepen, pressing against her eardrums. She could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a rhythmic reminder that time was a finite currency. Every tick was a second closer to the morning shift, a second closer to the arrival of the security teams, who scanned every inch of the building with paranoid precision. But they never scanned the cleaners. To them, Alina was as invisible as the air conditioning vents or the patterns on the wallpaper. The vacuum cleaner was her camouflage. Its roaring motor was a wall of sound that shielded her from the curiosity of any late-night security guards. They saw the rhythmic movement of her arm back and forth, and they saw a woman lost in the monotony of a menial task. They didn't see the way her eyes darted toward the computer screens, catching the reflection of login sequences in the glass of the framed awards on the wall. They didn't see the way she moved her cart with surgical precision, positioning it to block the view of the security cameras for the 30 seconds she needed to scan a document. It was a choreography of deception, perfected over 3,000 nights of labor. Outside, the city was a graveyard of ambition. The Potomac River flowed sluggishly, a dark ribbon of water reflecting the neon lights of the monuments. Alina looked out at the Washington Monument, an obelisk of white stone that stood like a finger pointing toward the heavens. It was a symbol of justice, of truth. But from where she stood, on the 64th floor of the Sterling and Associates building, it looked small, fragile. The real power didn't live in the monuments. It lived in the hard drives. She passed every night in the encrypted emails that flowed through the fiber-optic cables, beneath the streets and in the mistakes that men like Marcus Sterling buried under layers of legal jargon and offshore shell companies. She closed her eyes, and for a heartbeat, she wasn't in a skyscraper. She was back in their small, sun-drenched apartment in Alexandria. She could smell the cinnamon on David's breath, see the way his brow furrowed as he looked over the ledgers. "Something's wrong, Alina," he had said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "The numbers, they're bleeding." He had believed that telling the truth would set him free. He hadn't realized that in this city the truth was a commodity to be bought, sold, or buried in a shallow grave. When the police arrived, they didn't come with questions. They came with handcuffs and a narrative already written by the firm's PR department. They took his computers, his files, and his dignity. They left Alina with nothing but a mountain of legal fees and a burning, icy resolve that had sustained her through a decade of poverty. Alina slid the blue fragment into the lining of her cart. Her hands were steady now, the tremor of the first few years long gone. She turned off the vacuum, and the silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, expectant. She looked at the desk one last time. Tomorrow, Marcus Sterling would sit here. He would drink his $200 scotch. He would sign more papers, and he would believe he was untouchable. He didn't know that a ghost was in his room. He didn't know that the dust he stepped on was actually the ashes of his own legacy, being swept away by the woman he had forgotten existed. As she pushed her cart toward the service elevator, the first light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, a bruised purple line that signaled the end of her shift, and the beginning of their reckoning. The service elevator descended with a rhythmic, mechanical groan, a sound that resonated in Elena's marrow like a funeral dirge. The steel walls were scratched and dented, a stark contrast to the velvet-lined lifts used by the firm's clientele. To the world above, these shafts were the hidden veins of the building, necessary but unsightly. To Alina, they were the only paths that didn't require a smile or a lie. As the floor indicator flickered from 12 to 8, she felt the weight of the blue paper fragment in her paquita, small, jagged piece of a much larger, more lethal puzzle. It was more than evidence. it was a ghost's fingerprint. She had spent 3,000 nights waiting for a mistake, and Marcus Sterling had finally been human enough to make one. But the atmosphere in the building had shifted. There was a microscopic tension in the air, a static charge that hadn't been there an hour ago. It was the scent of ozone, not from the servers, but from the sudden, sharp acceleration of a cooling system in the restricted sub-basement. Alina stepped out into the hallway of the 4th floor, her heart a muffled drum against her ribs. She didn't head for the supply closet. Instead, she turned toward the archival wing-a labyrinth of windowless rooms where the dead files were kept. This was the place where history went to be forgotten, where the paper trails of 1,000 corporate sins were left to gather dust under the sterile glow of flickering fluorescent tubes. She stopped at the heavy oak doors of the central archive. Her breath came in shallow, controlled sips. She knew the security guard Miller would be finishing his rounds on the perimeter in exactly 4 minutes. Miller was a man of habit, a man who found comfort in the predictable crunch of his boots on the gravel path outside. He saw Alina every night, a fixture of the landscape, as unremarkable as a fire extinguisher. But tonight, the air felt thin. She reached into her cleaning cart, past the industrial-strength bleach and the tattered rags, and pulled out a key card. It wasn't hers. It was a cloned Ghosta digital skeleton key. She had spent 6 months' wages to acquire from a contact in the underbelly of the city. The reader chirped a sharp, electronic bird call that sounded like a gunshot in the hollow silence. Green, the lock disengaged with a heavy, metallic thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Alina slipped inside, the darkness of the archive swallowing her whole. The air here was different. It was ancient, smelling of dry ink, decomposing glue, and the faint, sweet rot of forgotten secrets. Rows upon rows of steel shelving stretched into the gloom like the ribs of a giant, metallic beast. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she used a small amber-lensed penlight, its beam cutting a narrow, dusty path through the shadows. She was looking for Box 400 to Delta. David had mentioned it once, in those final feverish days before the trial. "Everything is in the Delta," he had whispered, his eyes wide with a terror she hadn't understood at the time. He had been talking about a shadow ledger, a second set of books that recorded the donations made to the people who wrote the laws. Alina moved deeper into the stacks, the sound of her own pulse echoing in her ears, thumpus mimicking the sound of David's ventilator in the hospital. The guilt of her survival was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She had lived to see the sunrise he was denied, and that debt could only be paid in the currency of exposure. Suddenly, the floor above her creaked. It wasn't the settling of a skyscraper. It was the distinct, deliberate weight of footsteps. Someone was in Sterling's office. At 3 a.m, Alina froze, her body becoming a statue of navy blue fabric. She pressed her back against a cold steel shelf, the sharp edge of a file box digging into her shoulder blade. The footsteps were heavy, authoritative. Sterling, he was back. Why had he realized the blue memorandum was missing? Or was the conspiracy moving faster than her research? She heard the distant chime of the executive elevator, a high, melodic sound that felt like a mockery of her tension. Then the silence returned, heavier than before. Alina didn't move for 5 minutes, then 10. She counted her breaths, focusing on the way the air cooled her throat, trying to suppress the primal urge to bolt for the exit. She was a cleaner. She belonged in the shadows. But tonight, the shadows were no longer a sanctuary. They were a cage. She found the box. It was tucked behind a stack of mundane tax returns from the late 90s. It was unremarkably a gray cardboard container with a layer of fine gray silt on its lid. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for it. She didn't just open it. She performed an autopsy. Inside were hundreds of pages of pale blue bond, the same paper as the fragment in her pocket. Each sheet was a map of corruption dates, amounts, and names that would make the city burn if they ever saw the light of a courtroom. There were signatures she recognized from the evening news. Senators, judges, the very men who had stood on television and lamented the tragedy of David Thorne's fall from grace. A sudden, blinding light cut through the archive. Alina didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She simply closed her eyes as the beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight washed over her. Alina, the voice was low, gravelly. It was Miller, the security guard. He was standing in the doorway, his hand resting on the grip of his holster. The silhouette of his broad shoulders blocked the exit, his shadow stretching across the floor like an accusing finger. The amber light of her penlight looked pathetic against the white glare of his torch. "What are you doing in here, Alina? This wing is off-limits to the night crew. You know the protocol." The silence that followed was suffocating. Alina could feel the cold sweat breaking out on the nape of her neck, the salt stinging the small cuts on her fingers. She had two choices. She could plead ignorance, play the role of the confused elderly woman who had lost her way, or she could look him in the eye. She chose the latter. She slowly turned, the blue ledger clutched to her chest like a shield. "The floor was dusty, Miller," she said, her voice raspy but steady, carrying a weight of conviction that seemed to startle him. "There's so much dust in this building. No matter how much I sweep, the filth just keeps coming back. I thought I'd start at the source." Miller didn't move. The light from his torch didn't waver. He stepped into the room, the heavy soles of his boots clicking against the linoleum. He looked at the box, then at the ledger in her arms, and finally at the expression on her face, an expression of a woman who had nothing left to lose and an eternity of justice to gain. The air in the room grew colder, the scent of the old paper mingling with the metallic temps of fear. The confrontation was no longer about a breach of protocol. It was a collision of two worlds. The world of the silent servants and the world of the men who thought they owned the silence. The beam of the flashlight didn't move, but Miller's hand, his heavy, calloused hand, began to tremble just a fraction. The light danced across the blue linen paper, illuminating the signature of a man who had once promised Miller a pension that had vanished in a restructuring 5 years prior. The silence in the archive was no longer a vacuum. It was a living thing, heavy with the weight of shared betrayal. Miller looked from the ledger to Elena's face etched with the weary, inexorable patience of a mountain. He didn't see a thief. He saw a mirror. "My father worked the coal mines in West Virginia for 40 years, Miller whispered, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to crumble in the stagnant air. "He used to say that the men in the offices didn't have blood. They had ink. They don't see us, Alina. We're just the upholstery." He slowly lowered the flashlight, the blinding white glare fading into a soft amber pool on the floorboards. He stepped aside, his back pressing against the cold steel of the shelving unit. The perimeter cameras on the south exit have a blind spot near the loading dock. It lasts for 45 seconds every 10 minutes. "You have 3 minutes before I have to log my position." Alina didn't say thank you. A thank you would have been too small, too fragile for a moment of such profound, unspoken mutiny. She simply nodded, a single, sharp inclination of her head, and vanished into the darkness of the corridor. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, but her feet remained steady, rhythmic to the walk of a woman who had already died once and had nothing left to fear from the living. She moved through the loading dock, the air turning from the sterile, recycled chill of the office to the damp, biting humidity of a Washington dawn. The city was waking up. The first buses were groaning through the streets, their brakes squealing like prehistoric beasts. Alina walked 10 blocks, the ledger tucked beneath her worn coat, feeling the sharp corners of the paper pressing against her skin, a physical reminder of the truth she carried. She didn't go to the police. In this city, the police were often just the janitors of the powerful, cleaning up the messes that couldn't be ignored. Instead, she walked to a small, nondescript coffee shop in Adams Morgan, where a young woman with tired eyes and a laptop was already waiting. Sarah Jenkins was a journalist for a fading independent paper, a woman who still believed that a well-placed paragraph could change the world. When Alina placed the blue ledger on the scratched Formica table, the sound it made a dull, heavy thud seemed to ripple through the room. As Sarah turned the pages, her face went from professional curiosity to a mask of sheer, unadulterated shock. The shadow ledger didn't just contain David's innocence. It contained the funeral arrangements for an entire political dynasty. "This is," Sarah started, her voice failing her. She looked up at Alina, at the navy blue uniform, at the hands that had spent a decade scrubbing floors. "Why now? Why wait 10 years? Alina looked out the window at the rain beginning to streak the glassed-in gray lines that blurred the world outside. "Justice is like a slow-growing vine," she said, her voice sounding like the rustle of dry leaves. "If you pick the fruit too early, it's bitter. You have to wait until the weight of the rot makes it fall on its own. I didn't want a trial. I wanted a collapse. The collapse, when it arrived, was not a headline. It was an avalanche. Within 48 hours, the digital copies of the Blue Ledger were on every server from London to Tokyo. By the third day, the FBI, enabled to ignore the public, cacophony raided the offices at 1400 Pennsylvania Avenue. Alina watched it all from her small apartment, sitting in a chair that still smelled faintly of David's old tobacco. She saw Marcus Sterling being led out of the building in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a pale mask of disbelief as the cameras flashed like strobe lights in a storm. He looked small, he looked fragile, he looked clean. The firm was dismantled piece by piece. The offshore accounts were frozen, the donations were traced, and the men who had built their lives on the ruins of others were stripped of their titles, their homes, and their legacies. David's name was cleared in a 3-paragraph statement issued by a junior prosecutor, a cold, clinical correction of a decade-long lie. It wasn't an apology, but to Alina, it was a prayer. She returned to the building one last time, a month later. Not as an employee, but as a ghost, visiting the site of a haunting. The glass doors were chained. The gold lettering of Sterling and Associates had been scraped away, leaving only faint, ghostly outlines on the stone. The marble lobby was covered in a thin layer of dust. For the first time in 10 years, Alina didn't reach for a cloth. She didn't reach for a broom. She simply stood in the silence, listening to the echoes of the empire that had fallen. Justice does not always arrive with the blare of trumpets or the strike of a gavel. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet of the night, carried in the pocket of a woman the world chose to ignore. It arrives in the patience of the broken and the resolve of the silenced. As Alina turned and walked away from the hollow building, the sun finally broke through the clouds. Casting long, golden shadows across the pavement, she was no longer a cleaner. She was the architect of a new silence, a silence that was finally, beautifully pure. The story of Alina Thorne serves as a chilling reminder to those who sit in the high towers of power. You may own the air, the law, and the gold, but you do not own the people who keep your world turning. Behind every silent face, behind every invisible hand, there is a memory, and a memory fueled by love is the most dangerous weapon in existence. Do you ever stop to look at the people who move through your life unnoticed? The ones who clear your table, sweep your streets, or guard your doors. Perhaps it is time to ask yourself, if they were to look into the shadows of your life, what would they find? And more importantly, what would they do with the truth? If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the smallest voice can bring down the loudest lie, then subscribe to Gilded Scraps. We bring the forgotten stories to light, one grain of truth at a time. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Alina's journey. Until next time, remember that the silence is never truly empty.